We spent years believing our loyalty would earn us a place in the company's future, until one celebration exposed a truth colder than any layoff. The promised shares never reached the people who built the business. They landed in just one pair of hands, and everything changed in that silent moment. The first rumor drifted through the office like the smell of fresh coffee, subtle at first, impossible to ignore a few minutes later. Someone from finance whispered that the long-awaited company stock allocation had finally been approved. Screens stayed on, but almost nobody was working anymore. Conversations grew louder, hopeful smiles appeared across the office, and for the first time in years, it felt like everyone's sacrifices were finally about to matter. For nearly 4 years, leadership had repeated the same promise. Build this company with us, and when we succeed, you'll own a meaningful part of that success. Those words weren't just motivational speeches. They appeared in recruiting brochures, HR presentations, quarterly town halls, and executive emails. Managers repeated them during performance reviews whenever people questioned the long hours or turned down better-paying jobs elsewhere. Most of us stayed because we believed those promises. I certainly did. I joined the company when we were still small enough that everyone knew everyone else's name. We worked impossible hours, rescued failing client projects, skipped vacations, and accepted salary freezes because leadership kept reminding us that the real reward would come through equity compensation. No one expected to become rich overnight. We simply expected the company to keep its word. Then the invitation arrived. Mandatory company celebration. Friday, 4 p.m., Atrium. The email promised an exciting announcement about employee ownership. By lunchtime, the atrium was decorated with banners reading, "Celebrating our future together." Catering trucks arrived, music played through the speakers, and even HR seemed unusually cheerful. Around me, the excitement was impossible to miss. They finally approved the stock program. My manager said tenure would matter. I've waited years for this. For once, hope spread through the building faster than office gossip. At 4 o'clock, hundreds of employees gathered beneath the company logo. The CEO stepped onto the stage, wearing the confident smile we'd all seen 100 times before. He thanked everyone for their dedication. He praised employee loyalty. He talked about shared success. Then he announced that the Board Compensation Committee had officially approved the company's long-awaited stock distribution. The room erupted in applause. Finally, managers began handing out envelopes. My hands actually shook as I opened mine. The first line congratulated me on receiving company stock. Then I saw the numbers. I blinked, read them again. The grant was real, but it was tiny. After years of promises, overtime, and sacrifices, the entire package was worth surprisingly little. Far less than the examples leadership had repeatedly hinted at during presentations. Around me, smiles faded one by one. I thought there was another page. Is this the full amount? That can't be right. Employees quietly began comparing their letters. Almost everyone had received nearly identical stock grants. Someone with 12 years at the company had only slightly more shares than someone hired last year. Confusion quickly turned into disbelief. Then another set of numbers started circulating. The executive allocations. Someone from accounting had access to internal compensation figures. Within minutes, whispers spread through the atrium. The CEO's package is enormous. So are the vice presidents. What about the executive team? Every member of senior leadership had received stock worth hundreds of times more than ordinary employees. Then someone mentioned the CEO's son. He had worked at the company for less than a year in an executive development role. His stock package alone was worth more than what entire departments had received combined. Silence swept through the room. It wasn't just nepotism. It wasn't just the CEO's son. Nearly the entire executive team had divided the overwhelming majority of the company's equity among themselves, while giving the employees who had actually built the business symbolic scraps. Just enough to say everyone had received stock. Nowhere near what had been promised. People weren't angry because executives earned more. Most of us expected that. We were angry because the company had spent years promising meaningful employee ownership, and the documents had suggested something completely different from the tiny grants sitting in our envelopes. The celebration ended almost without a word. Desserts remained untouched. Music continued playing to a room that had gone strangely quiet. Back upstairs, things became even stranger. Managers suddenly received emergency meetings. HR representatives rushed between offices. Then the message started spreading. Please don't compare stock allocations. The compensation process has been finalized. If you have concerns, speak only with HR. Only with HR. Don't compare, don't discuss. The more leadership tried to calm everyone, the more obvious it became they wanted the issue buried before Monday morning. That evening, I opened an old folder on my laptop. Recruiting brochures, town hall presentations, HR emails, executive announcements. The promises were everywhere. One presentation clearly described an employee equity program that would provide meaningful ownership based on tenure, performance, and contribution. Another email encouraged employees to think of themselves as future owners of the company. None of it matched the stock grants we'd received. This wasn't simply disappointment anymore. It was a paper trail, a trail of broken promises. As I stared at those documents, my phone began filling with messages from coworkers. Do you still have the 2022 presentation? My offer packet says something very different. I saved every email. We need to compare everything. For the first time that day, I stopped thinking about my tiny stock grant. I started thinking about the documents. Because speeches can be forgotten, official promises are much harder to erase. What we uncovered after comparing those documents would make it impossible for leadership to quietly bury the truth. Monday morning didn't feel like the start of a work week. It felt like the morning after a storm. People still showed up on time, coffee machines still hummed, meetings still appeared on everyone's calendar, but something invisible had changed. Conversations stopped the moment a manager walked by. Slack channels that were usually filled with jokes and project updates had become eerily quiet. No one trusted the company anymore. By 9 o'clock, my inbox contained nearly 30 private messages. I found my offer letter. Look at page 7. Their numbers don't match what we received. One by one, employees began sharing old documents, recruitment brochures, annual meeting slides, emails from executives, HR presentations that had been forgotten for years. By lunchtime, we had assembled a timeline. It wasn't based on rumors. It was based on the company's own words. Every year, leadership had described the employee equity program in stronger language. Meaningful ownership. Sharing in the company's success. Rewarding long-term loyalty. Some presentations even included sample charts showing grants that were several times larger than what almost everyone had actually received. The differences weren't small. They were impossible to ignore. One engineer compared the documents to his stock allocation letter. According to the examples HR had shown during onboarding, his grant should have been worth nearly 10 times more. A project manager discovered the same thing. So did 2 designers, then 3 people from sales, then an entire customer support team. The pattern was becoming obvious. The company hadn't simply reduced the grants. It had distributed them in a completely different way than employees had been led to expect. Around 2 in the afternoon, HR sent an email to every employee. The subject line read, "Clarification regarding the equity program." It thanked everyone for their continued dedication and explained that stock allocations were determined using multiple confidential business factors. No actual explanation. No numbers, no acknowledgement of the promises employees had spent years hearing. The final paragraph asked employees not to share compensation information because it could create unnecessary misunderstandings. That sentence had the opposite effect. Within minutes, even more people started comparing their letters. The company had unintentionally united hundreds of employees around one question: where had all the stock gone? Late that afternoon, someone from finance quietly answered it. He never sent documents. He never leaked confidential spreadsheets. He simply performed basic math using information available in corporate filings and executive disclosures. His conclusion spread through private messages in less than an hour. Nearly the entire employee stock pool had been absorbed by senior leadership. The CEO, the executive team, several vice presidents, and of course, the CEO's son. Everyone else had divided what remained. It wasn't technically zero, but compared to what had been promised, it felt almost symbolic. The realization hit harder than the announcement itself. This hadn't been a last-minute mistake. Someone had approved it. Someone had signed the paperwork. Someone had decided that hundreds of employees deserved just enough stock to avoid saying they'd received nothing at all. That evening, a small group of us stayed after work in an empty conference room. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody talked about revenge. Instead, we spread documents across the table like investigators assembling evidence. Offer letters, screenshots, printed emails, town hall transcripts. One coworker highlighted nearly identical phrases appearing year after year. Another noticed something even more interesting. The wording changed 6 months before the stock distribution. Older documents repeatedly referred to employee ownership. Newer presentations quietly replaced those words with equity opportunities. A subtle change, easy to miss, but legally, it could mean something very different. The room fell silent. "Do you think they planned this?" someone asked. No one answered immediately, because nobody wanted to accuse the company without proof. Then Lisa, one of the senior accountants, slowly placed another document on the table. "I don't know if they planned it," she said, "but someone definitely prepared for the questions." It was an internal FAQ that managers had received before the celebration. None of us had seen it before. Every difficult question already had a scripted response. Why is my grant smaller than expected? Stock awards are based on confidential evaluation criteria. Please avoid comparing individual allocations. Refer additional concerns to HR. The answers had been written before anyone even opened their envelopes. That meant leadership knew exactly how employees would react. The room suddenly felt colder. The celebration, the speeches, the applause, even the carefully placed banners, it all felt rehearsed, as if someone had expected disappointment and prepared damage control before the first complaint was ever filed. The next morning, another surprise arrived. Calendar invitation, mandatory department meeting. Our director stood in front of the room holding a printed statement. He didn't look comfortable. "We understand some employees have concerns," he began. "The executive team asks everyone to remain professional and avoid spreading speculation that could damage trust within the organization." Someone in the back quietly asked, "What trust?" Nobody laughed. The director ignored the question. Then he added something none of us expected. "If you believe your allocation doesn't reflect previous communications, please submit your concerns directly to HR. Individual cases will be reviewed." There it was, an opening, small, carefully worded, but real. As the meeting ended, people exchanged silent glances. HR probably expected a handful of complaints. Instead, dozens of employees were already comparing notes. By lunchtime, that number had grown into the hundreds. The company had tried to keep everyone isolated. Instead, they had accidentally created the largest united employee response anyone could remember. And none of us realized that the very first HR complaint would trigger something leadership had spent months trying to avoid. The moment one complaint reached the wrong desk, the story stopped being an internal dispute and became something the company could no longer control. Have you ever worked for a company that promised one thing and delivered another? Share your experience below. Subscribe so you don't miss what happened after the employees decided to fight back the legal way. Monday morning felt nothing like a normal workday. People showed up, opened their laptops, and attended meetings, but nobody was thinking about work. Every conversation eventually circled back to one question. Did you look at your stock grant? Private messages flooded my inbox before 9 o'clock. I found my offer letter. My onboarding presentation says something completely different. Can we compare documents? By lunchtime, small groups had formed across the office. Employees weren't complaining anymore. They were collecting evidence. Old HR presentations, recruiting brochures, town hall slides, executive emails. The more documents we compared, the clearer the pattern became. Leadership hadn't simply encouraged loyalty. They had repeatedly described a meaningful employee ownership program tied to tenure, performance, and long-term contribution. Our stock grants didn't come close. Some employees had received barely a tenth of what earlier examples suggested. No one accused the company of breaking the law, not yet, but everyone agreed on one thing: something didn't add up. Late that afternoon, HR sent a company-wide email. It thanked everyone for their professionalism and explained that stock allocations were based on multiple business factors. There were no numbers, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the promises employees had been hearing for years. The final sentence stood out. We encourage employees not to compare individual compensation packages. That sentence had the opposite effect. Within an hour, even more people started comparing them. By Tuesday morning, dozens of employees had submitted formal HR complaints. Not emotional messages, but carefully written requests asking one simple question. Why do the official company documents describe an employee equity program that doesn't match the stock grants we received? Each complaint included supporting documents: offer letters, archived emails, presentation slides. It was difficult to dismiss complaints backed by the company's own records. HR responded with the same short acknowledgement to everyone. Your concern has been received and is under review. Nothing else. Meanwhile, something unusual was happening behind closed doors. Managers kept disappearing into unexpected meetings. Directors postponed project reviews. The executive floor remained unusually busy. Nobody knew exactly what was being discussed, but everyone could feel the tension growing. Then Lisa noticed something interesting. HR isn't investigating, she whispered during lunch. They're organizing. What do you mean? They've been asking managers to gather old presentations and employee communications. That changed everything. HR wasn't deciding the issue. They were collecting information, which meant the decision had likely moved somewhere else. Probably legal, or perhaps the board compensation committee itself. For the first time, we realized HR couldn't simply fix this. They hadn't designed the stock program. They were caught in the middle. That afternoon, another email arrived, this time asking employees to preserve any documents related to the equity program while questions were being reviewed. It wasn't called an investigation, but everyone understood what it meant. The company had stopped pretending nothing was wrong. As I packed my bag to leave, my phone buzzed. A coworker had sent one sentence. Someone from legal requested copies of the 2022 equity presentations. I stared at the screen for several seconds. If legal was asking for old documents, then our complaints had reached far beyond HR. And once company lawyers started asking questions, Burying the story would become much harder than explaining it. Thursday morning, I received a calendar invitation. Meeting with Human Resources. 10:30 a.m. No agenda, no explanation. Just the time, the room number, and the words, "Attendance requested." As I walked toward the conference room, people looked up from their desks. Nobody asked where I was going. They already knew. Inside, only 2 people were waiting, an HR manager I recognized, and someone I had never seen before. He wore a dark suit, no company badge, and a legal pad rested neatly in front of him. The HR manager smiled politely. "Thank you for coming." I sat down. She folded her hands. "We've reviewed your complaint." I nodded but said nothing. "We understand you have concerns about the equity compensation program." "I do." She slid a folder across the table. "We also understand you've been sharing company documents with other employees." There it was. Not the stock, the documents. I looked at the folder but didn't open it. "They aren't confidential," I said. "They were distributed by the company." The man in the suit finally spoke. "Can you tell us where you obtained them?" I couldn't help smiling. "Your onboarding portal." Silence. He wrote something on his legal pad. Then he asked another question. "Do you still have the original files?" "Every single one." "So do a lot of other employees." Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The HR manager carefully changed direction. "Our goal is simply to understand how expectations may have developed over time." "Expectations?" I asked. I opened my backpack and placed 3 printed presentations on the table. They weren't expectations. They were promises. She looked down at the documents. The dates stretched back nearly 4 years. Every presentation carried the company logo. Every slide encouraged employees to think of themselves as future owners. Neither of them argued. Instead, the man in the suit quietly asked, "May we make copies?" That surprised me. They didn't challenge the documents. They wanted them. I nodded. "Of course." The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Nobody threatened me. Nobody asked me to withdraw my complaint. Nobody even suggested I stop talking to coworkers. Walking back to my desk, I realized something important. The conversation hadn't been about convincing me. It had been about measuring how much evidence employees already had. An hour later, Lisa appeared beside my desk. They called me in too. What did they ask? The same questions. About the documents? She nodded. Not about my stock. By late afternoon, half a dozen coworkers reported nearly identical meetings. Different departments, different managers, same questions. Who had the documents? How many existed? Where had they come from? No one had been pressured. No one had been disciplined. If anything, legal seemed unusually careful, almost nervous. Then, just before 5 o'clock, my phone vibrated. A new email. The sender wasn't HR. It wasn't legal. It was the corporate secretary's office. The subject line read, "Request for confidential conversation." Inside was only one paragraph. "A member of the Board Compensation Committee would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you regarding materials referenced in your complaint. This conversation is voluntary and confidential." I read it twice. Then a third time. The board. Not management, not HR, the board itself. I slowly looked across the office. Almost at the same moment, Lisa turned toward me. She was holding her phone. Her expression told me everything before she even spoke. "You got one too." I nodded. For the first time since the stock announcement, it felt like someone above the executive team wanted to hear what had really happened. And if the Board Compensation Committee was asking employees questions directly, someone inside the company had already stopped believing the executive's version of the story. 6 months later, the invitation arrived. Mandatory all-hands meeting. No rumors, no speculation, just a time and a location. Every office joined the live stream. Thousands of employees watched in complete silence. When the broadcast began, something felt different immediately. The CEO wasn't there. Instead, the chair of the board appeared on the screen. He looked directly into the camera. Over the past several months, the board has overseen an independent review of the company's equity compensation program. He paused. The review found that the final allocation process was inconsistent with the employee equity program presented over multiple years. No one in the room moved. For the first time since this had started, someone had finally said it out loud. The chair continued. The board has accepted the resignation of our Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. A quiet gasp spread through the office. No applause, no celebration, just disbelief. The board has also accepted the resignation of the executive responsible for administering the final equity allocations. Everyone knew who that meant. The CEO's son. His name was never spoken. It didn't need to be. The chair wasn't finished. All employee equity awards will be recalculated using the original program criteria communicated to employees. Another pause. Eligible employees will also receive additional compensation to account for the delay. People looked at one another. Some smiled, others simply lowered their heads. Months of frustration suddenly felt real. The meeting ended after less than 15 minutes. No dramatic speeches. No excuses, just decisions. That afternoon, new equity agreements arrived. I stared at the number on my screen. Then I opened one of the old recruiting presentations I had saved months earlier. I compared the figures. For the first time, they matched. Almost exactly. I closed my eyes. Not because of the money, because the documents everyone said didn't matter had mattered more than anything else. Over the following weeks, the company announced sweeping governance reforms. Executive compensation would now require independent review. Employee equity programs could no longer be changed without written board approval. Conflict of interest disclosures became mandatory for every executive involved in compensation decisions. The policies weren't written for the future. They were written because of what had already happened. One Friday afternoon, I was cleaning out my desk when I found the original envelope. The one from the celebration. The one that had started everything. Inside was the tiny stock award that had made me feel invisible. For a moment, I thought about throwing it away. Instead, I placed it beside the new agreement. One represented a promise that had been broken. The other represented a promise that had finally been kept. Lisa walked past my desk. "You keeping those?" I nodded. "They belong together." She smiled. "Why?" "Because if I ever forget how easy it is for people in power to rewrite the truth," I looked at the first envelope, "I'll remember how ordinary employees rewrote the ending." As I left the building that evening, I looked back one last time. 6 months earlier, I thought this story was about stock. I was wrong. It was about accountability. The shares changed my financial future. The truth changed the company. And that's the only reason those shares were ever worth fighting for.